For centuries, the Forbidden City stood like a mirage carved from jade and gold, the gleaming symbol of absolute power and divine rule, shrouded in mystery and silence. Its towering red walls sealed off more than just territory. They imprisoned time itself, trapping within them the breath of generations, the whispers of ghosts, and the hidden agony of thousands of lives whose names history was never meant to remember. Behind every ceremonial march, every stroke of an emperor's brush, every glint of imperial armor polished under the rising sun, there pulsed an invisible current of sorrow. It was not the sorrow of kings or generals, but of women cloaked in silk and silence, locked in a theater of obedience. These were the concubines of the Forbidden City, not quite wives, not quite slaves, their existence suspended between privilege and imprisonment, like birds whose wings had been gilded. Only so no one noticed they had been clipped. Summer of 1424, and the air hung heavy with grief, though not all of it was sincere. The Yongle Emperor, a titan of conquest, the man who had moved a capital and carved his name into the annals of dynastic grandeur, was dead. His body, still warm with the breath of a god in the eyes of his people, lay in state, while the wheels of tradition began to turn. And they turned cruelly, for in the vast stillness of the inner court, 30 women, chosen from the hundreds who had once been summoned to his bed, were quietly handed squares of crimson silk. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a soft rustle of fabric, and the tremor that ran down 1,000 spines. Crimson, the imperial color of power. But in their hands, it was not a sign of status. It was a death sentence. They were not accused of any crime. Their only crime had been favor. To be noticed by the emperor in life meant they would now accompany him in death. These women, likely no older than 20, were expected to take their own lives. Not out of love, not out of grief, but because the emperor's will, even posthumously, demanded it. There were no cries for mercy, no protests. The silence was absolute. This was not loyalty. It was domination etched so deeply into the culture of the court that resistance had been forgotten long before these women were born. Some drank poison. Others hung themselves on the crimson silk, the very color of their supposed glory wrapping around their necks. Their bodies would be buried in ceremonial tombs near the emperors, tokens of loyalty in the architecture of death. But make no mistake, they were sacrifices. Willing or not, it was submission masked as custom, murder disguised as tradition. And yet the cruelty did not always wear such ceremonial robes. For most concubines, the torment was slower. A slow erosion of identity stretched across years behind lattice screens and lacquered doors. To the outside world, the Forbidden City was paradise, a realm of music, art, and divine elegance. But within the inner court, those perfumed halls were cages lined with gold. The concubines were trained from childhood, handpicked from noble families or poor ones with ambition, molded into perfection. They learned to play the zither like mist on a lake, to recite poetry as if sighing in a dream, to move as if their feet kissed the earth. But it wasn't art they were learning. It was submission, performance. They were being shaped into reflections of desire. Yet desire had a hierarchy, and only one man sat at its summit, the emperor. To be noticed by him meant elevation. A title, perhaps a child, perhaps even influence. But the emperor was one man, and the concubines, they numbered in the hundreds. For most, his gaze never came, and without it, their talents became dust. Days passed in orchestrated stillness, beautiful meals never tasted, silken robes worn only for ritual. Their conversations stifled, their emotions regulated. To speak out of turn was to risk demotion. To look too eager was to invite suspicion. One wrong step could mean banishment to the cold palace, a place where forgotten concubines withered in obscurity, never to be seen again. Some lived there for decades, slowly unraveling. Some never made it out alive. But there was an even deeper cruelty at work, time itself. These women were brought into the palace in their youth, most still in their early teens. Their bodies belonged to the state. Their fate was sealed. They were forbidden from marrying, forbidden from leaving, forbidden from returning home. Even after the emperor died, unless they bore him a son, they remained confined to the palace, trapped in rituals of mourning for a man who may have never even spoken to them. Some were widowed in spirit before they were ever touched in flesh. And yet, the outer world praised the splendor of imperial China. Tourists still marvel at the carvings, the courtyards, the dragon-throne halls, but few paused to imagine what it meant to live there. To be watched but never seen. To be treasured but never loved. To be surrounded by gold, but hungering for freedom. In such a world, even silence could be dangerous. Whispers of jealousy slithered like smoke through the corridors. Concubines plotted against one another. Poison was slipped into tea. Servants paid to spread rumors. It was said that the emperor's heart could be swayed by the faintest allegation. A blemish on a rival's reputation could mean her fall. So smiles became weapons, kindness became a tactic, and trust. Trust was a liability. Mothers betrayed daughters, friends became informants. And all the while, the emperor, a god among men, remained distant. Often indifferent. For him, they were options. Names in a ledger, beauties in waiting. And yet, within this claustrophobic world, moments of rebellion did flicker. Some concubines wrote secret poems, smuggling verses of longing and despair into the hands of sympathetic eunuchs. Others clung to memories of life before the palace, the smell of village rains, the sound of a brother's laughter. A few even found forbidden love among the eunuchs themselves, desperate, tragic bonds that were severed by torture or exile when discovered. One concubine, Lady Wang, was said to have carved her story into a wooden screen with a hairpin before she took her own life. The screen vanished during a fire. Some believe it still lies hidden within the ruins of a forgotten chamber. Her voice, like so many others, lost to the flames. And yet, these women, silenced, erased, diminished, were also the keepers of a strange kind of endurance. They embodied the cost of empire, the price of beauty, the illusion of power. Their presence reminds us that history, though written by emperors, is haunted by the unheard. And when we walk today through the halls of the Forbidden City, past the still gardens and crimson walls, we do not walk alone. Their footsteps are still there, silent and forgotten, echoing beneath the marble floors. And if you listen, truly listen, you may hear the rustle of silk, the soft weep of a song never sung aloud, the final breath of a girl who once dreamed of a life beyond the palace gates, and found instead a tomb made of gold. The Forbidden City never slept, its walls did not breathe, but they watched. Its courtyards held no wind, yet they whispered. And within that stillness, beneath the canopy of power, history continued its quiet, cruel rhythm. While emperors rose and fell, and dynasties shifted like tectonic plates of fate, the women of the inner court remained untouched by revolution, yet broken by tradition. In the centuries that followed Yongl's reign, the cycle of silence deepened. New emperors came with promises of peace or glory, but for the concubines, nothing changed. They still entered the palace as girls, their names erased upon arrival. They still learned to bow before they could think, and they still lived and died behind the same painted screens, surrounded by wealth they could never own, and love they could never choose. Under the Qianlong Emperor, the palace swelled to its most elaborate form. Art flourished, poetry blossomed, and the city itself became a sacred mirror of heaven. But for the women of the harem, it was merely a more gilded prison. The emperor, considered a philosopher king, kept hundreds of consorts, each chosen by decree, their fates sealed with a brushstroke. Rank governed every movement, from who could speak first, to who was allowed to wear yellow, to who would be permitted a child. But childbirth was not salvation. For many concubines, becoming a mother only invited more danger. Bearing a son meant political entanglement, intrigue, targets drawn on silk-clad backs. And if that son died under suspicious circumstances, the mother could be accused of treason, witchcraft, or divine disfavor. Punishments ranged from banishment to death by slow slicing, a method so brutal, it was believed the soul would scatter and never find rest. The illusion of safety was a mask, stitched tight over centuries of buried screams. Even the emperor's favor, when it came, was double-edged. For some, a single night in his chambers brought a life of elevation. For others, it led to madness. The rules governing imperial intimacy were rigid. Before being summoned, a concubine would be bathed in jasmine water, examined for blemishes, and perfumed with a blend of crushed pearls and musk. She was then wrapped in ceremonial robes and carried, literally carried, by eunuchs into the emperor's room. But nothing about this was romantic. It was process, politics, a ritual designed to strip away agency. The emperor did not choose with his heart. He chose based on omens, dreams, or the whisperings of ministers. A woman could be summoned once and never again. Or she could become the emperor's obsession, the fate often more terrifying than being forgotten. One such woman, Consort Zin, lived during the fall of the Qing dynasty. Known for her intelligence and beauty, she was among the few who dared to challenge court tradition. She supported modernization, read foreign literature, and allegedly advised the emperor on reforms. But power did not forgive ambition in a woman. Her influence stirred the ire of the Empress Dowager Cixi, a political titan who viewed any independence as a threat. When foreign troops stormed Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, the court fled. And in that moment of chaos, Cixi ordered Zin to be drowned, thrown into a well within the Forbidden City itself. Her death was never officially recorded. But the well remains covered, silent, and it's said that on certain nights, her voice can still be heard echoing from the stones, whispering regrets no history book will ever write. And what of those who did not die? What became of the concubines who lived long enough to see their beauty fade, their usefulness dry up like autumn leaves on palace stones? Most faded into shadow. Some were assigned meaningless titles: noble lady of the second rank, attendant of the western wing, honors that were ceremonial and hollow. A few, if they had borne sons who rose in power, could ascend to Empress Dowager themselves. But that path was paved with blood. To rise in the inner court meant stepping over the bones of sisters, rivals, and friends. Poison was a common weapon, so was strangulation. The court eunuchs, castrated as boys, loyal only to the system, served as spies, executioners, and gatekeepers. They too lived half-lives, forever twisted between servitude and control. And often, it was the eunuchs who whispered accusation that sealed a concubine's fate. As the centuries rolled on, the palace began to devour itself. The Forbidden City became less a seat of power, and more a mausoleum of obsolete glory. When the last emperor, Pui, came to power at the age of 2, the world outside had already changed. Railroads had cut through ancient provinces, telegraph lines sang with foreign words, and revolution stirred beneath the soil like an earthquake waiting to break. But inside the palace walls, the rituals continued. The concubines still bowed, still embroidered silken fans under lantern light, still waited, breathless, for a name to be called. Even as cannons roared outside the gates in 1911, signaling the end of the Qing dynasty, the women of the court remained frozen in a world that was no longer real. Some of them stayed even after the empire died. Pui was allowed to keep his title, and with it, a small portion of the palace. The concubines became relics, like ancient furniture no one dared to discard. They lived among shadows and memories, slowly unraveling. One by one, they passed away, their deaths recorded without ceremony. No tombs, no crimson silk, just quiet departures behind curtained doors. The last imperial concubine, Lady Wang Shuqin, reportedly died in the 1970s. Her final years were spent in poverty, far from the silk and splendor of her youth. By then, the Forbidden City had become a museum. Tourists wandered its halls, marveling at the architecture, snapping photographs where once women wept in silence. And yet, even in death, the concubines remain, not in name, but in echo. The ghosts of the Forbidden City are not the restless spirits of warriors or kings. They are the silent ones, the women whose lives were measured in glances, whose value was appraised like porcelain, whose thoughts were never written down. Some believe their spirits still linger, that late at night, when the moon cuts like a blade across the rooftops, the air carries the faint scent of incense and crushed plum blossoms. That in the palace of eternal harmony, where so many once dreamed of love and power, a cold wind sometimes passes through, and whispers your name. But perhaps the true haunting is not supernatural at all. Perhaps it's in the way we remember power, always from the top down. Perhaps it's in the way history celebrates emperors and overlooks the women who bore the weight of their desires. Perhaps the ghosts are not trying to scare us, they're trying to be heard, not with screams, but with truths. And now, when you see the Forbidden City, when you walk past the dragon throne, when you marvel at the gold leaf ceilings and carved jade dragons, you'll know that every corner, every stone, every delicate brush stroke was built on lives that were taken not in battle, but in silence. Not in glory, but in obedience. The Forbidden City was never truly forbidden to outsiders. It was forbidden to those within.